Don't sign that. Ava's voice cut through the room like a thin crack in glass, quiet but impossible to ignore, and for a fraction of a second, the entire boardroom held its breath as if the air itself had tightened around her words. Daniel Whitmore's pen hovered just above the final line of the contract, a black ink tip suspended over millions of dollars, over reputations, over futures, and he didn't look at her at first. Didn't even acknowledge that the voice had come from a 17-year-old black girl. Standing near the side wall where assistants were meant to blend into silence, the room was all polished oak and floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan sunlight spilling in across the table in long, sharp lines that reflected off watches, cufflinks, and the smooth surface of the document in front of him, and Ava stood there in a borrowed blazer that didn't quite fit, sleeves just a little too long. Fingers curled lightly against a folder she had no authority to hold, her heart beating steady, not fast, not panicked, just steady, the way it had learned to be years ago, when she realized that panic never changed outcomes, only clarity did. Someone let out a small, awkward chuckle from the far end of the table, the kind that people use when they assume something insignificant has just happened, something easily dismissed, and Daniel finally lifted his eyes, not to her, but to the reflection of her in the glass behind her. As if even acknowledging her directly would give her more weight than she deserved. "Excuse me?" one of the executives said, his tone measured, polite in a way that carried distance, and Ava didn't move, didn't shrink, didn't apologize for speaking out of turn because she already knew that the line had been crossed the moment she stepped into that room, and stepping back now wouldn't erase it. "That clause," she said, her voice still calm, still even. "It doesn't protect your company." And now a few more heads turned, not fully, just enough to register that this was continuing, that this interruption had decided not to fade away, and Daniel's fingers tightened slightly around the pen, the subtle shift visible only in the way the light caught the tension in his knuckles. Outside, a low bank of clouds was beginning to gather over the skyline, casting a faint shadow across the glass, and inside, the temperature of the room seemed to drop by a degree, not physically, but perceptibly, the kind of shift people feel before they understand it. Ava took one step forward, just enough for the light to reach her face, revealing eyes that weren't defiant or emotional but focused, precise. As if she were reading something invisible that no one else had noticed, and for a brief moment, the silence stretched thin, like a wire pulled too tight, waiting to snap. Daniel exhaled slowly through his nose, a controlled, practiced breath, and lowered his gaze back to the contract as if returning to a task already decided, already beneath interruption, and the pen dipped closer to the page. "You're about to give away control," Ava said, and this time the words landed heavier, not louder, but sharper, cutting through the low murmur that had started to ripple around the table, and somewhere behind her, someone whispered, "Who is she?" while another voice answered under their breath, "Just an intern." And the label settled into the room like a verdict. Daniel paused again, just long enough for doubt to flicker across his reflection, not in his eyes, but in the slight delay of movement, and then the moment passed, his expression smoothing back into certainty, into the confidence that had built empires and silenced opposition, and without looking up, without asking another question, without granting her another second of acknowledgement, he pressed the pen to the paper, signing his name in one continuous motion as the first distant roll of thunder echoed somewhere beyond the glass, too far away to matter, at least for now. The ink dried almost instantly, a thin black signature sealing something far heavier than the paper could hold, and the faint murmur in the room shifted from curiosity to quiet approval as chairs creaked and executives leaned back with the subtle satisfaction of a deal completed, of numbers aligned, of power exercised without resistance. And Ava stood exactly where she was, not moving, not reacting, as if the moment had not ended for her the way it had for everyone else. The sunlight that had once cut clean lines across the table now dimmed slightly as clouds thickened outside, softening the reflections on the glass walls and turning the room into something more muted, more enclosed, and for a second, she watched the signature, the curve of his name, the final stroke that connected everything together. And she memorized it the way someone memorizes the last detail before a shift they know cannot be undone. "Well," one of the senior partners said, breaking the silence with a light clap of his hands. That concludes it. And a few others followed with small nods, tablets lighting up as assistants began organizing follow-up tasks, voices low, efficient, already moving on to what came next, because in rooms like this, the next step always mattered more than the last decision. Ava lowered her gaze to the folder in her hands, the edges slightly worn from being handled too many times, and inside were the same documents, the same language, the same structure she had seen before, not in a place like this, not with polished wood and tailored suits, but at a kitchen table years ago, under a flickering overhead light where her father had traced lines of text with a tired finger, trying to understand what he was signing, trusting people who spoke with the same calm certainty, the same controlled confidence that now filled this room. She could still remember the way he had leaned back in his chair afterward, exhaling like the weight had lifted, like everything was finally going to be stable, and she remembered the weeks that followed when everything quietly began to fall apart, not all at once, not dramatically, but in small, irreversible steps, missed calls, delayed payments, a silence that grew heavier with each passing day until it settled into something permanent. You can return to your station, a voice near her said, polite but firm, and she looked up to see a woman in a navy suit gesturing gently toward the door, her expression professional, not unkind, just distant, the kind of distance that keeps order intact, and Ava nodded once, a small, controlled movement, as if acknowledging a rule she had never expected to break in the first place. She turned, her shoes making soft contact against the marble floor, each step measured, steady, and behind her the room resumed its rhythm, voices overlapping, plans forming, the sound of success continuing uninterrupted, as though her words had never existed, as though the moment had not paused at all. The hallway outside felt cooler, the air quieter, the hum of the building more noticeable now that the tension of the boardroom had released, and the overhead lights cast a clean, even glow across the long stretch of polished floor, reflecting her figure in faint, repeating patterns as she walked. She pushed through the glass doors into the lobby, where the space opened wide, ceilings rising high above, the city visible through towering windows now shadowed by thickening clouds, and for the first time since she spoke, she allowed herself to stop. Her fingers loosened slightly around the folder, and she inhaled. Slowly, deeply, feeling the air settle into her lungs with a calm that did not come from relief but from certainty, the kind that does not need validation, the kind that exists even when no one listens. Outside, a distant flash of lightning traced briefly across the sky, followed by a low rumble that rolled through the city, still far enough away to be ignored by most, but close enough to be noticed by those paying attention. And Ava lifted her eyes toward the glass, watching the shift in light. The way the reflection of the building flickered for just a second before steadying again, and she did not turn back, did not wait, because she already knew that what had been set in motion upstairs would not stay contained for long. Upstairs, the boardroom doors closed with a soft, controlled click, sealing in the quiet confidence that had settled over the executives, and Daniel Whitmore remained at the head of the table, his posture unchanged, shoulders squared, fingers resting lightly against the polished surface as if nothing unusual had occurred, while across from him a series of screens flickered to life, projecting timelines, projections, and projected gains in clean, precise columns of numbers that stretched into the future with mathematical certainty. We move forward immediately, Daniel said, his voice even, measured, the same tone that had guided countless decisions before this one, and the room responded in rhythm, assistants taking notes, legal advisors nodding, each person playing their role with practiced efficiency, yet beneath the surface, there was a subtle hesitation, not spoken, not acknowledged, but present in the slight delay before responses, in the way one analyst leaned closer to his tablet, scrolling back through a clause he had already reviewed, and another adjusted his glasses, rereading a section that suddenly felt less clear than it had moments ago. Daniel noticed none of it, or perhaps he chose not to, his attention fixed forward, on momentum, on the expectation that success was something to be continued, not questioned, and as he stood, the room followed. Chairs sliding back in near unison, a quiet choreography of authority and compliance. Outside the boardroom, the hallway carried a different energy, quieter, slower, as if the building itself was holding something in reserve, and down in the lobby, Ava remained near the window, her reflection faint against the glass as the sky darkened further, the first drops of rain beginning to trace thin lines downward, distorting the city beyond into shifting patterns of gray and silver. She did not check her phone. Did not open the folder again, because she already knew every word inside. Every hidden turn of language, every carefully placed ambiguity that allowed responsibility to move without being seen, and she remembered the exact moment years ago when she had first learned how easily truth could be buried under complexity, how a single line could redirect everything without anyone noticing until it was too late. Behind her, the front doors opened and closed in steady intervals as people moved in and out of the building, their footsteps echoing lightly across the marble floor, each one focused on their own direction, their own timeline, and none of them aware of the quiet shift that had already begun above them. Back upstairs, a junior associate hesitated near the end of the table, his hand hovering over his tablet before finally speaking. "Sir, there is a subsection in the liability framework that I would like to revisit." And the room stilled just enough for the words to register, not as a challenge, but as a small interruption in the flow, and Daniel turned his head slightly, not fully, just enough to acknowledge the presence of the voice, his expression composed, patient in a way that suggested control rather than openness. "We have already reviewed every section," he replied, calm, definitive, and the associate nodded quickly, the instinct to withdraw stronger than the impulse to question further, his hand lowering as the moment passed, absorbed into the larger movement of the meeting. Outside, the rain intensified, tapping steadily against the glass, each drop adding to a growing rhythm that filled the spaces between conversations, and Ava watched as the reflections in the window blurred further, the lines of buildings bending slightly under the distortion, and for a brief second, the image of the tower behind her fractured into overlapping shapes before settling again. She closed her eyes for just a moment, not out of doubt, but out of recognition, because she had seen this pattern before, not in the details, not in the people, but in the sequence, the quiet dismissal, the confident continuation. The subtle signals that went ignored until they could no longer be contained, and when she opened them again, her gaze was steady, fixed. Not on what was happening now, but on what would come next, because she understood something the others did not, that collapse never begins with noise, it begins with silence that no one chooses to hear. The rain settled into a steady rhythm against the glass, no longer distant, no longer ignorable, and upstairs the energy in the boardroom shifted in ways that were small enough to dismiss but consistent enough to feel, like a faint imbalance in a perfectly leveled structure, and Daniel Whitmore stood near the head of the table reviewing the next sequence of actions while a legal advisor flipped through printed pages, slower now, less certain than before, the crisp confidence that had filled the room minutes earlier thinning into something more cautious. "We will finalize compliance integration by end of day," Daniel said, his voice carrying the same authority, the same expectation of execution, but one of the senior analysts hesitated before responding, his eyes fixed on a section of the document, thumb pressing lightly against the margin as if holding the place steady. "There is a cross-reference here," he began carefully, not challenging, just clarifying. "It connects liability back to the parent entity under expanded interpretation." And the words hung there, not dramatic, not loud, but precise enough to cause a pause, a real one this time, and Daniel turned fully now, his gaze settling on the analyst, sharper, more focused, as if deciding whether the interruption deserved attention or correction. "That interpretation has already been cleared," Daniel replied, but his tone, while controlled, carried a fraction less certainty than before, a subtle shift that only someone paying close attention would notice, and the analyst nodded, though not immediately, just a beat too late, enough to reveal that the answer had not fully resolved the question. Across the table, another executive adjusted his chair, leaning forward to scan the same section, his finger tracing the lines more slowly than necessary, as if reading not just for confirmation but for reassurance, and the quiet in the room stretched again. Longer this time, the kind that builds when confidence meets something it cannot immediately absorb. Outside, the storm deepened, rain striking the windows in sharper patterns, each drop adding to a layered sound that filled the background like static, and down in the lobby, Ava shifted her weight slightly, her reflection now blurred by the constant motion of water across the glass, the city beyond reduced to shapes and shadows, and she watched the distortion without surprise. Because she understood that clarity rarely disappears all at once, it bends. First, it softens, it becomes harder to define until people convince themselves it was never clear to begin with. A security guard passed behind her, footsteps steady, radio murmuring softly at his side, and for a moment he glanced toward her, not recognizing her role, not needing to, just another presence in a building full of movement, and she gave a small nod before returning her gaze to the window, her posture unchanged, her breathing even, as if she were waiting not for something to happen, but for something to reveal itself. Upstairs, a notification tone broke through the quiet, sharp and unexpected, and one of the assistants looked down at her screen, her expression tightening slightly as she read, then again, as if confirming what she saw, and she leaned toward the executive beside her, whispering something too low to carry across the table, but the effect was immediate, a shift in posture, a quick glance exchanged, the beginning of awareness spreading in small, controlled increments. Daniel noticed this, of course he did, his eyes moving from one subtle change to another, mapping the room the way he always had, reading reactions before they formed into statements, and for the first time since the signing, he felt it, not doubt, not yet, but resistance, the faint pushback of something beneath the surface, and he straightened slightly, his hand resting on the back of his chair as if grounding himself in the space. "If there is something to address, we address it now," he said, not raising his voice, but directing it with precision, and the room responded, attention tightening, focus narrowing, because this was the moment where uncertainty either dissolved or took shape. The assistant lifted her screen just enough to show the executive beside her, and though the details were not yet spoken aloud, the tension they created was visible, in the slight narrowing of eyes, in the careful way the device was angled, as if containing something that could not yet be released without consequence. Outside, lightning flashed again, closer this time, illuminating the skyline in a brief, stark outline before fading back into gray, and Ava watched it without flinching, her expression unchanged, because she knew that what was beginning upstairs would not arrive all at once, it would unfold piece by piece, line by line, until the structure that had seemed so certain revealed the weight it could not carry, and when it did, it would not need noise to announce it, only the quiet realization that everything had already started to give way. The room did not erupt, it tightened, like something invisible had begun to press inward from all sides, and the assistant finally spoke, her voice controlled but no longer neutral. "There are incoming alerts tied to the acquisition structure." And she turned the screen slightly, enough for the nearest executive to see the red indicators lining the edge of the display, small but unmistakable, each one representing a trigger that had not been expected to activate this soon, and the executive leaned closer, his expression shifting from focus to concern in a fraction of a second, his fingers scrolling quickly, too quickly, as if speed might change what he was seeing. Daniel did not move immediately, but his gaze sharpened, tracking the exchange with precision, measuring reactions, calculating impact before words were fully formed, and when he stepped forward, it was deliberate, each movement controlled, each second accounted for, until he stood beside the assistant and looked directly at the screen. The numbers were no longer projections, they were responses, live adjustments rippling through connected systems, compliance flags surfacing, external partners re-evaluating exposure, and somewhere within that flow, the clause Ava had pointed to began to reveal itself, not as a single issue, but as a network of consequences unfolding in real time. "Explain," Daniel said, his voice low, steady, but no longer dismissive, and the assistant swallowed once before answering. "The liability mapping is cascading back through the parent structure. It is being interpreted as full responsibility under multiple jurisdictions." And the words settled heavily into the room, not because they were loud, but because they were precise, and precision left no room for easy dismissal. Across the table, the analyst who had hesitated earlier now leaned forward again, more certain this time, his earlier doubt replaced by recognition. "It is expanding beyond the original scope," he added, his tone careful but firm, and another executive shook his head slightly, not in disagreement, but in disbelief, as if trying to reconcile the clean simplicity of the signed document with the complexity now unfolding on the screens. Daniel's jaw tightened, just enough to be visible in the reflection of the glass behind him, and he reached for the printed contract, flipping to the section in question with controlled speed, his eyes scanning the lines, not for the first time, but now with a different intent, no longer confirming, but searching. And the room watched him, not speaking, not interrupting, because this was the moment where authority met consequence, and no one wanted to be the one to define it first. Outside, the storm pressed harder against the building, rain striking in sharper bursts, wind bending the lines of water across the glass so that the city beyond seemed to shift and sway, and down in the lobby, Ava remained still. Her reflection nearly lost now in the constant motion, her outline blending into the surface as if she were part of the building itself, quiet, present, and unmovable. Upstairs, Daniel stopped on a single line, his finger resting against the margin, and for a brief second, everything else fell away, the voices, the screens, the movement, leaving only the text and the realization forming behind his eyes, slow but undeniable, and he inhaled, not deeply, not dramatically, just enough to steady the shift occurring within him. This was not isolated, he said finally, not looking up, his voice carrying across the room with a weight that had not been there before, and the assistant nodded. No, sir, it connects to multiple exposure points, and the analyst added quietly. If it continues to propagate, it will redefine the entire agreement. And silence followed, real silence this time, not the controlled quiet of confidence, but the kind that comes when something irreversible begins to take shape. Daniel straightened slightly, the contract still open in his hand, and for the first time since the meeting began, he looked toward the door, not at anyone in particular, but at the space itself, as if measuring the distance between what had happened and what could still be changed. And, though he said nothing further, the shift in the room was complete, because everyone there understood, even without words, that the decision made minutes ago was no longer contained to a signature on paper. It was moving, expanding, becoming something that could not simply be undone by authority alone, and somewhere beyond the walls, beyond the glass, beyond the controlled environment they had relied on. The consequences were already unfolding, one precise step at a time. The room did not move for a long moment, not because there was nothing to do, but because every possible action now carried weight, and Daniel Whitmore stood with the contract still open in his hand, the paper no longer just a document but something heavier, something that seemed to anchor him in place as the quiet stretched around him. Outside, the rain softened slightly, shifting from sharp impacts to a steady curtain that blurred the skyline into muted shapes, and the light in the room dimmed with it, turning reflections into softer, less defined forms across the glass and polished surfaces. One by one, the screens continued to update, not dramatically, not with alarms or flashes, but with subtle changes in numbers, percentages adjusting, exposure lines extending, each small movement reinforcing what had already begun, and no one spoke, not immediately, because the language they had relied on, projections, forecasts, controlled outcomes, no longer felt precise enough to describe what was happening. Daniel lowered the contract slowly, placing it on the table with care, aligning it with the edge as if restoring order to something that had shifted, and his hand lingered there for a second, fingers resting flat against the paper, feeling its presence, its finality. Across from him, the analyst who had first questioned the clause sat back slightly, his shoulders no longer tense, not relaxed, but settled into a different kind of awareness, the kind that comes after recognition replaces uncertainty. And he did not look at Daniel, not directly, because the moment was no longer about proving a point, it was about understanding the scope of what had been set in motion. A soft hum from the ventilation system filled the background, steady, unchanging, contrasting with the subtle shifts occurring across the room, and somewhere near the far end of the table, an assistant closed her tablet gently, the sound barely audible but distinct in the silence, marking a pause, not an end, just a pause. Down in the lobby, Ava stood in the same place, her reflection now clearer as the rain eased, the lines of the city slowly returning behind the glass, and she watched the transition without moving, her breathing even, her posture unchanged, as if she were part of the stillness itself. A faint reflection of the upper floors shimmered in the glass above her, distorted slightly by the remaining droplets, and for a moment, the building seemed to hold two versions of itself, one solid and structured, the other shifting and uncertain. Upstairs, Daniel finally spoke, not to command, not to direct, but to acknowledge. "We reassess," he said, the words simple, stripped of the certainty they had carried before, and no one responded immediately, not because they disagreed, but because the statement marked a change, a shift from control to recognition, and that shift required a different kind of attention. The legal advisor nodded slowly, already turning pages again, this time not to confirm but to understand, and the analyst leaned forward once more, not hesitant now, but focused, tracing the implications line by line, as if mapping a path through something that had already begun to unfold. Daniel stepped back from the table, just a single step, but enough to change his position in the room, no longer at the center of motion, but slightly removed from it, observing rather than directing, and his gaze moved briefly toward the glass wall, where his reflection stood against the softened light, less defined than before, less certain in its edges. Outside, the storm continued to move across the city. Not intensifying, not fading completely, just passing through, leaving behind a quieter atmosphere, and inside, the silence remained, not heavy, not tense, but deliberate, the kind that allows realization to settle fully without interruption, and in that silence, without anyone needing to say it aloud, the shape of what had happened became clear, not as a single mistake, not as an isolated oversight, but as something deeper, something that had been visible for a moment, spoken in a calm voice that had not been given weight, and now, standing in the quiet that followed, the room held that realization with a stillness that no longer tried to push it away. The realization did not arrive all at once, it settled in layers, quiet and undeniable, and Daniel Whitmore stood near the glass wall now, no longer holding the contract, his hands resting loosely at his sides as he looked out over the city that had once felt entirely within his control, the skylines slowly reappearing as the rain thinned into a light mist. The edges of buildings sharpening again as if the world itself was clarifying something he had chosen not to see. Behind him, the room had changed, not in structure, not in layout, but in tone. Voices were lower, movements more deliberate, each person no longer performing certainty but searching for it, and the screens that had once displayed projections now carried active data streams, confirmations of what had already begun to shift beyond the walls of the building. "It is expanding into external review channels," the legal advisor said quietly, not announcing, not warning, simply stating what was now evident, and another voice followed. "Partners are flagging exposure." Each update precise, contained, yet building a larger picture that no one could reduce to a simple correction. Daniel exhaled slowly, his reflection in the glass steady but altered, not in appearance, but in presence, as if something behind it had shifted position, and he closed his eyes for just a brief moment, not out of frustration, not out of defeat, but out of recognition, the kind that does not argue, does not negotiate, only accepts, a memory. Surfaced, uninvited but clear, the sound of a quiet voice in the room minutes earlier, steady, certain, not asking for attention, not demanding authority, just stating what was true, and he opened his eyes again, turning slightly, his gaze moving across the table, across the faces that now avoided assumptions, avoided quick conclusions, until it settled on the empty space near the door where she had stood. "Who was she?" he asked, the question simple, but carrying more weight than anything he had said since the signing, and for a moment, no one answered, not because they did not know, but because the question itself marked a shift, a reordering of what mattered. An assistant checked her notes quickly, her voice careful. "Ava Johnson, she is listed as an intern under temporary assignment." And the words hung in the air, not impressive on their own, not powerful, but undeniable in context, and Daniel nodded once, slowly, as if placing the name into a structure he had not considered before. Across the room, the analyst looked up, his expression no longer uncertain. "She identified the clause before execution," he said, not as a challenge, not as a correction, but as a fact, and another executive added quietly, "She was the only one who did." And silence followed again, but this time it was different, not heavy, not tense, but clarifying, like a space where something had finally aligned. Daniel turned fully now, stepping away from the glass, his posture still composed, but no longer anchored in the same certainty, and he looked at the contract on the table, the signature that had once represented completion now marking the beginning of something far more complex, and he understood it, not intellectually, but completely. That the moment he had dismissed had not been insignificant, it had been precise, necessary, and ignored. "Find her," he said, not raising his voice, not issuing a command in the way he once would have, but stating it with a quiet clarity that left no room for delay, and the room responded immediately, not out of obligation, but out of shared understanding, because the direction had shifted, from control to correction, from authority to recognition. Down in the lobby, Ava finally moved, not quickly, not urgently. Just a single step away from the glass, her reflection separating from the surface as the last drops of rain slid down the window, and she adjusted the folder in her hands, her grip light, her expression unchanged, because she did not need to look back to know that the moment had reached them. She had felt it long before it arrived, in the silence that followed her words, in the stillness that had settled after she spoke, and as she walked toward the exit, the doors opening softly ahead of her, the air outside cooler, cleaner after the storm, she carried nothing with her except the certainty that truth, once spoken, does not disappear, it waits, and eventually it is seen. The doors had already closed behind her when the call reached the lobby, not loud, not urgent, but directed. "Miss Johnson." And Ava paused just beyond the threshold, one hand lightly resting against the cool metal bar of the exit door as she turned, not quickly, not surprised, just aware that the moment had finally caught up. The lobby behind her carried a different weight now, the earlier stillness replaced by a quiet movement of purpose, footsteps measured, voices low but intentional, and through the wide glass panels she could see one of the senior assistants approaching, her posture straight, her pace controlled, as if carrying something that required care rather than speed. Ava stepped back inside without hesitation, the door closing softly behind her, sealing out the damp air of the street, and the assistant stopped a few feet away, maintaining a respectful distance, not authoritative, not dismissive, just present. "Mr. Whitmore would like to speak with you," she said, her tone even, but lacking the earlier distance that had defined her voice, and Ava nodded once, not asking why, not needing explanation, because the reason had already unfolded. The elevator ride was quiet, the soft hum of motion filling the space between them as the numbers climbed, each floor passing with a subtle shift in light, reflections sliding across the polished metal walls, and Ava stood with her hands relaxed at her sides. Her expression unchanged, her breathing steady, as if she were returning to a place she had never fully left. When the doors opened, the hallway seemed longer than before, the light softer, the reflections less sharp, and as they walked, the sounds from the boardroom reached them in fragments, not loud, but continuous, the rhythm of a space no longer operating on assumption. The assistant stopped at the door, opening it just enough to signal her forward, and Ava stepped inside, the room turning toward her in unison, not dramatically, not abruptly, but with a shared awareness that her presence now carried a different meaning. Daniel Whitmore stood near the center of the room, no longer at the head of the table, his posture composed but altered. The distance between authority and acknowledgement no longer as defined, and for a brief moment neither of them spoke, the silence stretching just long enough to hold everything that had shifted since she last stood there. "You saw it," he said finally, his voice quieter than before, not diminished, but grounded, and Ava met his gaze without hesitation. "Yes," she replied, her tone steady, without emphasis, without need to prove, and the room remained still, listening not just to the words, but to the space between them. Daniel nodded once, slowly, as if confirming something he had already understood, and he glanced briefly at the contract on the table before returning his attention to her. "Why did you speak up?" he asked, not as a challenge, not as a test, but as a question that carried genuine weight, and Ava held that question for a second, not searching for an answer, but choosing how to place it. "Because I have seen what happens when no one does," she said, her voice even, her eyes steady, and there was no accusation in her words, no edge, only truth stated plainly, and something in the room shifted again, not dramatically, but perceptibly, like a line being drawn with clarity rather than force. Daniel exhaled quietly, his gaze lowering for just a moment before lifting again, and for the first time, the distance between them was not defined by position, but by perspective. "We are going to correct it," he said, not as a declaration of control, but as a statement of intent, and Ava nodded once, acknowledging the direction without attaching herself to it, because correction was not the same as understanding, and understanding could not be assigned, it had to be reached. She adjusted the folder slightly in her hands, the motion small, almost unnoticeable. And then she spoke again, not louder, not softer, but with the same calm clarity that had cut through the room before. "It is not just about fixing the contract," she said, and Daniel listened, fully now, without interruption. "It is about seeing the line before it is signed." And the words settled into the space between them, not heavy, not light, but precise, and no one in the room moved to interrupt them, because they understood that this moment was not about hierarchy, it was about alignment. Outside, the last traces of rain faded from the glass, leaving the skyline clear, the light returning in soft reflections across the room, and Ava stood there without shifting, without pressing further, because she had already said what mattered, and whether it would be carried forward or not was no longer something she needed to control. The room did not rush to fill the silence after her words, it held it, carefully, as if any sudden movement might break something that had only just settled into place, and Daniel Whitmore remained standing where he was, not at the head of the table, not directing, not correcting, just present. His gaze resting briefly on the contract before shifting toward the glass wall where the city stretched out under a sky that had cleared almost completely, the last traces of rain clinging to the surface. In thin, fading lines, the light returned slowly, not sharp, not blinding, but soft, spreading across the room in a quiet wash that touched the edges of the table, the backs of chairs, the still faces of those who had not yet moved, and in that light, the reflections changed, no longer fractured or distorted, but steady, simple, as if the building itself had exhaled. No one spoke, not because there was nothing left to say, but because what remained did not need words, it needed space, and that space was allowed to exist, uninterrupted, as Daniel stepped forward just once, closing the distance between himself and the table, his hand resting lightly on the surface where the contract lay, not gripping it, not turning pages, just acknowledging its presence. His shoulders lowered slightly, a movement so small it might have gone unnoticed in any other moment, but here, it carried weight, a quiet release of something that had been held too tightly for too long, and his reflection in the glass shifted with him, no longer aligned with the sharp edges of authority, but softened by something less defined, something more human. Across the room, the others remained still, not frozen, not uncertain, but attentive in a different way, as if witnessing a shift that did not require their participation, only their awareness, and the screens, once filled with movement and numbers, dimmed gradually as systems paused, recalibrated, leaving behind a quieter glow that matched the tone of the room. Ava stood where she was, not at the center, not at the edge, simply within the space, her posture unchanged, her hands resting lightly against the folder, her presence steady, unforced, and she did not look around for reaction, did not measure the impact of what had passed, because she did not need confirmation to understand what had already taken place. The air felt different now, lighter, not because the problem had disappeared, but because it had been seen, and in that recognition, something had shifted from hidden to known, from ignored to acknowledged, and that change carried its own quiet gravity. Outside, the city moved as it always did, cars tracing steady lines below, distant sounds rising and falling in patterns too far away to define, and the sky above held a pale, even light that reflected cleanly across the glass, leaving no distortion behind. Daniel lifted his hand from the table slowly, his fingers brushing once against the edge of the contract before falling back to his side, and he did not speak again, did not issue another directive, because the moment did not call for more control, it called for stillness, for the kind of pause that allows understanding to take root without being forced. Ava shifted her weight just slightly. A small movement that signaled nothing dramatic, only readiness, and then she turned. Not abruptly, not with finality, but with the same quiet intention that had defined every step she had taken, her shoes moving softly across the floor as she walked toward the door. No one stopped her, no one called after her, because there was nothing to hold her there, nothing left to prove or explain, and as she reached the threshold, the light from the hallway met the light from the room, blending without contrast, creating a single, continuous space. The door opened without sound, and she stepped through, her figure passing from one reflection into another before disappearing from view, leaving behind a room that remained still for a moment longer. Not empty, not resolved, but changed, and in that quiet, with the light settled and the air unmoving, the shape of what had been understood lingered, not spoken, not announced, but present in every breath that followed.